The initial idea for my topic came to me in my junior year literature class on the day that we concluded Hamlet. Mr. Andrew explained the process of how one receives an education and how the individual must be in a state of discomfort or harrowing to be educated. This idea followed me as I became curious of the process of how a person is actually educated. While thinking of what topic I was going to write about, I began straying from this idea of harrowing, mostly because I did not want to spend my last semester of high school researching why people are miserable. But there was a different element that I could not quite deduce, which kept me on this question of what certain aspects are essential to learning. I knew that in order to be educated, some form of new knowledge must be created. But I wondered where the educating actually begins and what tools are required for developing new knowledge. I was reminded of To Kill a Mockingbird and how the story centers around Scout receiving some kind of an education about the world around her. By analyzing how she learns, I came to the conclusion that the essential tool of the Scout's education is her imagination. This tool that every individual has in their mind has some connection to learning. In order to prove this, I first had to decide how you exactly define the imagination, and then I could figure out how it grants the individual the ability to learn. Once I was finally able to narrow down my question, it became, how does one define the imagination, and why is it the essential component of receiving an education? I continued to go into further detail on this question and wondered how this idea is valuable, and how does the use of one's imagination allow them to live well in community with others? I wondered why escaping from reality would actually be helpful in developing the way a person lives in their reality. To answer these questions, I needed a foundational understanding of what the imagination is. For this, I turned to Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. This essay by J.R.R. Tolkien discusses the value of imagination through the lens of fairy tales. Tolkien explains how fairy tales open up a desire to know, which constitutes the faculty of imagination. The reader is opened up to the action of imagining, which prompts them to create their own imaginative world. After developing an idea of what imagination is, I needed to examine how this looks in a person's life. This turned me to Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. In this book, I was able to analyze how Scout uses her imagination to learn and investigate whether her imagination agrees with how Tolkien described in his essay. I found that the way in which Scout and Tolkien use imagination is not exactly the same. The character of Scout draws from her life experiences and then imagines herself in the shoes of another person. Tolkien, on the other hand, says that the best way to use the imagination is to completely escape from your current reality and dive into a story with some element of fantasy to it. The fantastical element breaks down the walls of the mind, allowing the individual to think in ways they previously could not have done. He says that you must dive into a world apart from yourself to release your preconceived notions in order to produce new thought. As I wrestled with the differences in application, I had to ask the question, which is more effective for receiving an education? To help solve this, I looked at Peter Pan. In this text, the world of Neverland acts as the secondary world in which Tolkien says the broadening of the mind happens. The story depicts how Wendy and her brothers enter the world of Neverland and go on adventures that teach them how to use their imagination to its full extent and apply their lessons back to reality. Peter Pan describes the faculty of imagination that Tolkien says is most effective for receiving an education because the children are able to enter a fantastical world in which their mind is able to develop new thought, and then they are able to return to reality where they use this learned knowledge in real life. Through looking at how Tolkien defines the imagination and analyzing the way in which To Kill a Mockingbird and Peter Pan use this faculty to learn, I came to the conclusion that the most effective tool in receiving an education is using the imagination to place oneself in a sub-created reality, allowing the individual to view their world as apart from themselves and ultimately gain new knowledge that can be applied to their reality.